The train whistle screamed through the Montana Territory air like a wounded animal, and Clara Owens pressed her gloved hand against the cool glass of the passenger car window, watching red cloud emerge from the dusty horizon like a mirage she half hoped would disappear. Her left leg throbbed with that familiar ache, the one that had accompanied her since childhood fever had ravaged her body and left her with a permanent limp that marked each step she took. The advertisement had seemed like Providence when she had found it 3 months ago, carefully worded and respectful, seeking a bride for a Montana rancher who valued character over appearances. She had responded with trembling hands, her letter honest about everything except the one detail she had convinced herself would not matter once he saw her heart. Now, as the train lurched to a stop in September of 1882, that omission felt like a stone in her chest. The platform was sparse, just weathered wood planks and a handful of people waiting to greet arrivals or send off loved ones. Clara gathered her carpet bag and the small trunk that held everything she owned in this world, stepping carefully down from the train with the conductor's assistance. Her left foot touched down unevenly, and she compensated automatically, a movement so practiced she barely noticed it anymore. But others always did. Harold Preston stood beside a polished buggy, his hat in his hands, his eyes scanning the disembarking passengers with obvious anticipation. Clara recognized him from the photograph he had sent, though he looked older in person, more weathered by sun and wind. Their eyes met across the platform, and she saw the moment of recognition followed immediately by something else. Confusion, perhaps, or the beginning of disappointment. "Miss Owens," he called, though his voice lacked the warmth his letters had contained. "Mr. Preston," she replied, managing a smile despite the anxiety coiling in her stomach. She walked toward him, her gait uneven, the limp impossible to hide. 20 paces had never felt so long. His expression shifted through several emotions as she approached, finally settling into a tight politeness that felt worse than outright anger would have. "I was not expecting." He began, then stopped himself, his jaw working. "I apologize for not mentioning it in my correspondence," Clara said quietly, keeping her chin up despite the heat rising in her cheeks. "I should have been forthright. It was cowardly of me to omit such information." Harold Preston was silent for a long moment, and Clara could see the people on the platform beginning to notice, to whisper behind gloved hands and raised newspapers. A woman with obvious pity in her eyes, a man with undisguised curiosity. She wanted to sink into the earth. "I cannot," Harold said finally, his voice low but firm. "I work a ranch that demands physical capability. I need a wife who can keep up with the demands of frontier life. I am sorry, Miss Owens, but I must rescind my offer of marriage." The words hit her like physical blows, though she had half expected them from the moment she had seen his face. "I understand," she managed to say, though her voice wavered. "I will return on the next train east." "That would be tomorrow afternoon," a station attendant offered helpfully, appearing at her elbow. "No eastbound until then." Harold Preston looked uncomfortable now, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "I can provide funds for lodging at the boarding house." "It is the least I can do, given the circumstances and your long journey." Pride warred with practicality in Clara's chest. She had perhaps $3 to her name, barely enough for a meal and certainly not enough for both lodging and a return ticket to Boston. "Thank you," she said stiffly, accepting the bills he pressed into her hand without counting them. It felt like payment for her humiliation. He loaded her trunk onto his buggy without meeting her eyes, drove her the 3 blocks to the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Fletcher, and deposited her belongings on the front porch with a mumbled goodbye that might have been an apology. Then he was gone, dust rising from his horse's hooves as he fled back to his ranch, and whatever life he had imagined with a wife who could walk properly. Mrs. Fletcher, a kindly woman with steel-gray hair and knowing eyes, took one look at Clara's face and asked no questions. She showed her to a small room on the second floor, refused payment until the following morning, and brought up a tray of soup and bread that Clara could not bring herself to eat. She sat on the narrow bed and stared at the faded wallpaper, feeling the weight of her failure pressing down on her shoulders like a physical thing. This had been her last hope. Boston held nothing for her anymore. Her parents were 5 years dead. Her brother had his own family and no room for a spinster sister with a limp who could barely earn enough as a seamstress to keep herself fed. The mail-order bride advertisement had seemed like a door opening when all others had closed. Now even that had slammed shut. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. The sun set beyond her window, painting the Montana sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if she had been in any state to appreciate them. She lay back on the bed, still fully dressed, and tried to imagine what she would do when she returned to Boston. Perhaps she could find work in a factory. Perhaps she could convince her brother to let her stay in his attic. Perhaps she would simply disappear into the masses of struggling women who populated the tenements and barely survived. Sleep came in fits and starts, troubled by dreams of walking endlessly toward horizons that never grew closer. Morning brought weak sunshine through thin curtains and the smell of coffee drifting up from the kitchen below. Clara rose, washed her face in the basin on the dresser, and did her best to make herself presentable. Her dress was wrinkled from sleeping in it, but her other dresses were in the trunk, and she could not bear to unpack as if she were staying. Mrs. Fletcher was in the dining room, serving breakfast to a handful of boarders. She waved Clara to a seat at the long table and brought her coffee and eggs without being asked. "Thank you," Clara murmured, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "Eat," Mrs. Fletcher instructed gently. "Whatever trouble brought you here looks better on a full stomach." Clara managed a few bites, though the food tasted like ash. The other boarders were men mostly, ranch hands and workers from the lumber mill, who ate quickly and left for their various employments. One older gentleman lingered over his coffee, reading a newspaper that was several weeks old by the date on the masthead. "Shame about Preston," Mrs. Fletcher said conversationally, refilling Clara's cup. "Man's been looking for a wife for 3 years now. Too particular by half, if you ask me. Last woman who came out, he turned away because she was too tall. Before that, one was too educated for his tastes. You would think a man pushing 40 would be less choosy." Clara felt a flicker of anger kindle in her chest, warming her from the inside. "He is entitled to his preferences," she said carefully. "Preferences are one thing. Unrealistic expectations are another." Mrs. Fletcher settled into the chair across from her. "What will you do, dear? Return to Boston on the afternoon train? I have no reason to stay. None at all. Red Cloud is small, but there are opportunities for a woman willing to work. We have no seamstress in town since old Mr. Harrington passed. His shop has been sitting empty for 2 months now." The kindness in the offer made Clara's throat tight. "I have no funds to rent a shop, let alone stock it with supplies." Mrs. Fletcher hummed thoughtfully. "Well, the offer stands if circumstances change. You seem like a sensible woman, Miss Owens, the kind this town could use more of." Clara excused herself after breakfast, unable to bear more kindness when her future felt so bleak. She walked slowly through the town, her limp pronounced after the long journey and restless night. Red Cloud was smaller than she had imagined, just a main street with false-fronted buildings housing the essentials. General store, saloon, bank, sheriff's office, livery stable, and a church with a white steeple that needed fresh paint. Mountains rose in the distance, still capped with snow despite the late summer warmth. It should have been beautiful. It should have been home. She found herself at the empty tailor shop Mrs. Fletcher had mentioned, peering through the dusty window at the abandoned workspace inside. A cutting table, a dress form, shelves that had once held bolts of fabric now empty and forlorn. Her fingers itched with the memory of needle and thread, the one skill she possessed that had any value. Interested in the space, Clara turned, startled, to find a man standing behind her. He was tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and dark hair that needed cutting. His clothes marked him as a working cowboy, worn denim, and a shirt that had been mended more than once. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, warm brown and direct without being intrusive. He held his hat in his hands, a gesture of respect she had not expected from a stranger on the street. "Just looking," she said. "I am only passing through." "That is a shame. Town could use a seamstress." He paused, then seemed to make a decision. "I am Dalton Matthews. I work the Double Barham Ranch about 5 miles north of here." Clara Owens. She did not offer her hand, unsure of the protocol. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Owens." His smile was genuine, reaching his eyes and crinkling the corners. "You are the lady who came in on yesterday's train." News travels fast in a small town. Heat flooded her cheeks. "I imagine it does. I am sure everyone knows about Harold Preston's rejected bride." Something shifted in Dalton Matthews' expression, a tightening around his mouth. "Preston is a fool." The blunt statement surprised her into silence. He continued, his voice matter of fact rather than pitying. "I have known Harold Preston for 10 years. He is a decent rancher but a poor judge of character. Any man who would turn away a woman who traveled 2,000 miles on the strength of his word is not worthy of respect." He was honest about his needs, Clara found herself defending, though she was not sure why. A ranch wife must be capable of hard physical work. A ranch wife must be capable of many things. Physical strength is only one and not the most important. Dalton settled his hat back on his head, his gaze thoughtful. "Would you walk with me, Miss Owens? I know it is forward of me to ask, but I would appreciate the company, and you look like you could use a friendly conversation." Clara hesitated. Every rule of propriety she had been raised with said she should decline, should return to the boarding house and wait out the hours until her train arrived. But something in his steady regard, the absence of pity or discomfort when he looked at her, made her want to say yes. "I do not walk quickly," she said instead of declining. "I have a limp. I noticed, does not bother me any." He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation she took it. They began walking slowly down the wooden sidewalk, their pace matched. Clara waited for him to pull ahead, to show impatience with her slower gait, but he simply adjusted his stride to hers as naturally as breathing. "See," he said after a moment, his voice warm with something that might have been amusement. "You walk perfectly beside me." The words settled into her chest like a warm coal, glowing against the cold disappointment of the previous day. She did not trust herself to respond, so she simply walked, letting him guide their path toward the edge of town, where buildings gave way to open grassland. "I came west 5 years ago," Dalton said, breaking the companionable silence. "From Kentucky originally. My father bred horses, beautiful animals, but he drank away the farm and everything else. I wanted a fresh start somewhere I could make my own way." "Did you find it?" Clara asked. "I did. The Double Barham is owned by a man named Marcus Donnelly, good and fair. He gave me a chance when I had nothing but calloused hands and a willingness to work. Now I am his foreman, and I have saved enough to think about starting my own spread someday." They walked further, leaving the last buildings behind. The Montana landscape stretched before them, rolling grassland and distant mountains, so vast it made Clara feel small and insignificant in a way that was oddly comforting. "What brought you to Red Cloud?" Dalton asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Desperation, I suppose, and hope, foolish as that sounds." Clara found herself talking, the words spilling out more easily than she had intended. She told him about Boston, about her parents' deaths and her brother's reluctance to help, about the advertisement and her decision to omit the truth of her condition. "I should have been honest from the beginning. The fault is mine. The fault is Preston's for being too blind to see past a limp." Dalton's voice held an edge now, sharp with disapproval. "You were honest about everything that matters: character, faith, willingness to work. What does it matter how you walk? It matters for the work. He was right about that." "Was he?" "My mother had a limp from a riding accident when she was a girl. She still ran a household, raised 5 children, managed the farm accounts, and could outwork most women half her age. Her limp did not stop her from doing anything she set her mind to." Clara felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. "That is kind of you to say. It is true, not just kind." He stopped walking, turning to face her. "Miss Owens, I know we have only just met, and you have every reason to be wary of men making promises in Montana territory, but I would like to offer you an alternative to returning to Boston." Her heart began to pound, though she was not sure if it was from hope or fear. "What kind of alternative?" "The Double Bar M employs about 15 men, and not one of them can sew on a button without stabbing themselves bloody. We are all in desperate need of mending, alterations, and general repair of our clothes. Mr. Donnelly's wife passed 2 years ago, and there has been no woman's touch around the ranch since. I am certain I could convince him to provide room and board in exchange for sewing work. It would give you time to decide what you want to do next, at least. And if you wanted to try opening that shop in town eventually, you could build up some savings." It was too good to be true. Clara's mind immediately began cataloging all the ways this could be a trap, a trick, or a disaster waiting to happen. "I could not possibly impose on your employer like that." "It would not be an imposition. It would be an employment arrangement, fair and square. You would work. He would provide compensation in the form of room and board. If things worked out, perhaps a small wage as well." Dalton's expression was earnest, no trace of deception or ulterior motive that Clara could detect. "I am not asking you to marry anyone or make any promises beyond honest work, just giving you an option besides going back to a place that holds no future for you." "Why?" Clara asked, the question bursting out before she could stop it. "Why would you help a complete stranger?" Dalton was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to the mountains in the distance. "5 years ago, I stepped off a train in Billings with $2 and a sack of clothes. A rancher named Donnelly was there picking up supplies, and he saw me standing on that platform looking lost. He offered me a job on the spot, no references, no questions about my past. Just a chance." He looked back at Clara, his brown eyes serious. "Maybe I am paying that kindness forward. Or maybe I just hate seeing someone give up when they do not have to." Clara took a shaky breath, her mind racing. It was reckless to even consider this. She knew nothing about this man beyond a 10-minute conversation. But the alternative was returning to Boston to a life of certain poverty and misery, slowly wearing herself down in a factory or begging her brother for scraps of charity. "I would need to speak with Mr. Donnelly myself," she said slowly, "to ensure this arrangement is truly acceptable to him." A smile broke across Dalton's face, transforming his features from serious to almost boyish. "Of course. I would not have it any other way. He comes into town every Saturday for supplies. That is tomorrow. I could arrange a meeting somewhere public so you feel safe. The restaurant, perhaps, or Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house dining room. The dining room would be appropriate, Clara agreed, her heart still pounding but now with something that felt dangerously close to hope. They walked back to town together, talking more easily now. Dalton told her about life on the ranch, the rhythm of seasons and work, the satisfaction of honest labor under open sky. Clara found herself relaxing, even laughing at his story about a particularly stubborn horse that had dumped him in a water trough in front of the entire crew. When they reached the boarding house, he tipped his hat to her, his smile warm and genuine. I will send word to Mr. Donnelly tonight and arrange the meeting for tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock if that suits you. That would be fine. Thank you, Mr. Matthews. Dalton, please. We are not formal people out here, Miss Owens. Then you must call me Clara, Clara. He said her name like he was testing the weight of it, and something in the way his voice shaped the syllables made her stomach flutter. I will see you tomorrow morning, Clara. She watched him walk toward the livery stable, his stride easy and confident, and wondered what she had just agreed to. Mrs. Fletcher appeared at her elbow, making her jump. That is Dalton Matthews, the older woman said approvingly. Good man, that one. Honest as the day is long and twice as hard-working. If he is vouching for this arrangement, you can trust it is legitimate. You know him well. Well enough. He comes into town most Saturdays, always polite, always pays his debts. Sends money back to his sister in Kentucky every month like clockwork. The kind of man this territory needs more of. Mrs. Fletcher patted Clara's arm. Whatever he offered you, I would consider it carefully, dear. Might be the opportunity you need. That night, Clara lay awake again, but this time her thoughts were not weighted with despair. She imagined what life on a ranch might be like, the work she could do, the possibility of saving money and maybe, eventually, opening that shop in town. It was not the future she had planned when she had boarded the train in Boston, but it was a future nonetheless. That was more than she had possessed yesterday. Morning brought clearer skies and nervous anticipation. Clara dressed in her best dress, a deep blue that brought out the color of her eyes, and pinned her blonde hair carefully. She ate a small breakfast, her stomach too unsettled for more, and waited in the parlor until precisely 10 o'clock. Dalton arrived 5 minutes early with a man Clara assumed was Marcus Donnelly. The ranch owner was in his 50s, with graying hair and a weathered face that spoke of decades under the Montana sun. He had kind eyes, though, and his handshake was firm and respectful when Dalton made introductions. Mrs. Fletcher provided coffee and disappeared discreetly, giving them privacy while remaining close enough to preserve propriety. Dalton tells me you are a seamstress by trade, Marcus Donnelly began without preamble. That true? Yes, sir. I have been sewing since I was a child, professionally for the past 6 years in Boston. Can you do more than basic mending? My men are hard on their clothes. They need sturdy repairs, not just cosmetic fixes. I can reinforce seams, replace buttons, patch worn areas so they hold up to heavy use. I have experience with work clothes specifically. My father was a dock worker before he passed, and I maintained his clothing and that of his crew for years. Donnelly nodded, seeming satisfied. Dalton suggested room and board in exchange for 20 hours of sewing work per week. That seemed fair to you. Clara did not have to feign her relief. More than fair, sir. I would be happy to work more hours if needed to justify the arrangement. We will see how it goes. I am not a man who takes advantage, Miss Owens. You work your 20 hours, you earn your keep. Anything beyond that, we can discuss wages. He paused, his gaze assessing but not unkind. I will be straight with you. My ranch is 15 men living rough. They are good men, but they are cowboys, not gentlemen. There will be rough language and rougher manners. If that troubles you, this is not the place. I understand, Mr. Donnelly. I am not afraid of hard work or plain speaking. Good. There is a small cottage on the property. Used to be the foreman's quarters before I built the new bunkhouse. It has been empty for a year, but it is sound. 2 rooms, a stove, a bed. You would have privacy and safety. Meals you can take in the main house kitchen. My cook, Lewis, is the best in Montana territory, and he will be glad of company. Clara felt tears threatening again and forced them back. When would you want me to start? Can you ride in a wagon? Yes, sir. Then today, if you are willing. I am heading back after I finish my business in town. We can collect your things and have you settled by supper time. It was happening so fast, but Clara found she did not want to slow it down, did not want time to second guess or doubt. I am willing. Thank you, Mr. Donnelly. You will not regret this. See that I do not. But he smiled when he said it, the sternness softening. He stood, shook her hand again, and nodded to Dalton. I will be ready to leave in 2 hours. Meet me at the general store. When he had gone, Clara turned to Dalton, words failing her. He seemed to understand, his smile gentle. It is a good place, Clara. You will be safe there, I promise you that. I do not know how to thank you. No thanks needed. Just seeing you smile instead of looking like the world has ended is payment enough. He stood, settling his hat on his head. I need to help Mr. Donnelly load supplies, but I will see you when you arrive at the ranch. Welcome to the Double Bar M. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of activity. Clara settled her account with Mrs. Fletcher, who refused to take payment for the second night and pressed a package of cookies into her hands for the journey. She repacked her trunk, checked and double-checked that she had everything, and tried to calm her racing heart. She was doing this. She was really doing this. Staying in Montana territory, working on a ranch, building a life from nothing with only her skills and determination to guide her. The wagon ride took just over an hour, following a dirt road that wound through grassland dotted with cattle. Marcus Donnelly was not talkative, but he pointed out landmarks and boundaries, explaining the layout of his property with obvious pride. The Double Bar M was substantial, he told her, nearly 3,000 acres of grazing land and a small creek that provided year-round water. The ranch buildings came into view as they crested a low hill. A large main house built of logs and stone, a barn that looked sturdy and well-maintained, corrals and outbuildings, and a long bunkhouse with smoke rising from its chimney. Away from the main cluster, almost hidden by a stand of cottonwood trees, stood a small cottage with a peaked roof and a narrow porch. That is yours, Donnelly said, pointing. Like I said, it is not fancy, but it is sound. Clara's throat tightened. It was the first space that had been truly hers since her parents had died. It looks perfect. Donnelly helped her down from the wagon, showing no reaction to her uneven gait, and carried her trunk to the cottage himself, despite her protests. The interior was simple but clean, clearly swept out and readied for her arrival. A narrow bed with a quilt, a table and 2 chairs, a wood stove and a basin for washing. One window looked toward the main house, the other toward the mountains. I will have one of the men bring firewood, Donnelly said. Lewis will ring the bell for supper at 6. Come up to the main house kitchen, and he will show you where everything is. Tomorrow, Dalton will bring you the mending to start on. When he left, Clara stood in the center of her new home and slowly turned in a circle, taking it all in. It was not what she had imagined when she had left Boston. It was better. She unpacked methodically, hanging her few dresses on the pegs by the door, arranging her sewing supplies on the table, placing her mother's Bible on the windowsill where the light would catch it in the mornings. By the time she finished, the cottage felt less empty, touched with the beginnings of home. A knock on the door startled her. She opened it to find Dalton standing there, his arms loaded with split firewood. "Thought you might need this," he said. "Nights get cold, even this time of year." Clara stepped back to let him in, watching as he efficiently stacked the wood beside the stove. His movements were economical and sure, the habits of a man who had done such tasks 1,000 times. "Thank you," she said when he finished, "for the wood and for everything else. I still cannot quite believe this is real. It is real. You are here, you have work, you have a place to sleep that is yours. That is as real as it gets." He dusted off his hands and moved toward the door, then paused. "Clara, I want you to know that you are safe here. The men might be rough around the edges, but Mr. Donnelly runs a tight operation. Anyone who shows you disrespect will answer to him and to me. You have my word on that." The intensity in his voice surprised her. "I trust you," she said, and realized it was true. She barely knew this man, but every instinct told her he was exactly what he appeared to be: honest, kind, and trustworthy. His expression softened. "Good. That matters to me more than you might think." He settled his hat more firmly on his head. "I should let you rest. It has been a long few days. But I will see you at supper." "You will." That evening, Clara made her way to the main house, her limp pronounced from the day's activities but her spirits higher than they had been in months. The kitchen was large and warm, dominated by a massive iron stove and a table that could seat 20. A man with sun-weathered skin and silver-streaked black hair looked up from the pot he was stirring, his face breaking into a welcoming smile. "You must be Miss Clara," he said in accented English, his voice rich and warm. "I am Louis. Welcome to my kitchen. Sit, sit. Supper is almost ready, and you look like you need feeding." Clara found herself seated with a cup of coffee in her hands while Louis moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, talking the entire time. He had come north from Mexico 15 years ago, he told her, and had been cooking for the Double Bar M for a decade. He spoke of Mr. Donnelly with obvious respect and affection, of the men with exasperated fondness, and of Dalton with particular warmth. "That one, he is special," Louis said, gesturing with a wooden spoon. "Good heart, that boy. Works harder than any two men, never complains, always helps the others. You did well to have him for a friend, Miss Clara." "He has been very kind," Clara agreed, sipping the strong, hot coffee. The men began filing in for supper, stomping dust from their boots and hanging hats on pegs by the door. They were a varied group, young and old, clean-shaven and bearded, but they all showed Clara the same courteous respect. Dalton arrived last, taking a seat across from her at the long table with an easy smile. Supper was beef stew with vegetables, fresh bread, and apple pie that Louis served with obvious pride. The conversation flowed around Clara, the men discussing the day's work, plans for tomorrow, a horse that needed shoeing and a fence that needed mending. They included her when appropriate, asking polite questions about her journey and her first impressions of Montana, but never prying or making her uncomfortable. She caught Dalton watching her several times, his expression thoughtful, and each time their eyes met, he smiled in a way that made warmth spread through her chest. After supper, Dalton walked her back to the cottage even though it was barely 100 yards and still light outside. "They liked you," he said as they walked slowly across the dusty yard. "I could tell. They were very welcoming. I was nervous about being the only woman in a camp of men, but Louis was right. They are good people. We try to be." He stopped at her door, his hat in his hands again. "Clara, I know this is all new and probably overwhelming. If you need anything at all, my bunk is the last one on the right in the bunkhouse. Do not hesitate to ask." "I will. Thank you, Dalton, for everything. I mean that." He looked like he wanted to say something else, but instead he just nodded, settled his hat back on his head, and walked away into the gathering dusk. Clara entered her cottage and lit the oil lamp, chasing shadows into the corners. She prepared for bed slowly, her body exhausted but her mind still racing. Tomorrow would bring work, the beginning of this new life she had stumbled into. Tomorrow she would prove she was worth the chance she had been given. Tomorrow felt full of possibility in a way yesterday had not. The days settled into a rhythm that Clara found comforting in its predictability. She woke with the sun, made breakfast on her small stove, and spent her mornings mending the seemingly endless pile of torn shirts, worn denim, and damaged work clothes that Dalton brought to her cottage. The work was satisfying, her hands remembering skills honed over years, and she took pride in each neat seam and sturdy patch. Afternoons she spent in Lewis's kitchen, helping prepare the evening meal and learning about the ranch. The cook was a fountain of information and stories, and Clara found herself looking forward to their conversations as much as the work itself. Evenings brought supper with the men, the long table full of food and laughter and easy companionship. And always, there was Dalton. He never sought her out obviously, never made his attention uncomfortable or unwelcome, but he was there, sitting across from her at meals, appearing to help carry supplies to her cottage, walking her back after supper with conversation that ranged from the practical to the philosophical. She learned that he was 26 to her 23, that he loved horses more than cattle but respected both, that he missed his sister but not the life he had left behind in Kentucky. He learned that she had taught herself to read music and missed playing piano more than almost anything, that she loved thunderstorms and hated winter, that her limp was from childhood fever and rarely pained her despite its appearance. 3 weeks into her time at the Double Bar M, Dalton appeared at her cottage after breakfast with an unusual request. "We are moving cattle to the north pasture today," he said, leaning against the doorframe in a way that made Clara's heart skip inexplicably. "It is a full-day operation, and we will take lunch out on the range. Lewis usually packs food, but his rheumatism is bothering him this morning. I know it is not in your arrangement, but would you be willing to help prepare the lunch packs? I would count it as a personal favor, and I would owe you one in return." "Of course," Clara said immediately. "I am happy to help. What do you need?" An hour later, she was in the kitchen with Lewis directing her from his seat by the stove, his knee propped on a stool. Together they prepared sandwiches, packed apples and cookies, and filled canteens with water and coffee. The men rode out just after dawn, a cloud of dust and the sound of cattle lowing, and Clara watched them go with a strange tightness in her chest. "You worry for him," Lewis observed, appearing at her elbow. "For all of them," Clara corrected, but she knew it was not quite true. Her eyes had followed Dalton's figure on horseback until he disappeared over the ridge. "It is okay to care for one more than the others," Lewis said gently. "The heart knows what it wants, even when the head is not ready to admit it." Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. "We are friends, that is all. For now, maybe, but I see how he looks at you, Miss Clara, and I see how you look at him when you think no one is watching." Old Lewis knows the signs of two hearts beginning to lean toward each other. She wanted to protest, but the words felt hollow even in her own mind. The truth was that Dalton Matthews had become the best part of her days. His smile made her smile, his presence made her feel settled in a way she had not felt since her parents had died. But surely it was too soon, too fast, too fragile to be anything real. The men returned as the sun was setting, tired and dusty but satisfied with the day's work. Dalton found Clara helping Lewis with supper preparations and reported that the lunch had been perfect, exactly what they needed. "You are a lifesaver," he said, his smile warm despite the exhaustion evident in the set of his shoulders. "I definitely owe you that favor now." "I will think of something," Clara replied, surprised by the teasing note in her own voice. That night, lying in her bed and listening to the wind moving through the cottonwood trees, Clara admitted to herself what Lewis had already seen. She was falling in love with Dalton Matthews. It terrified her and thrilled her in equal measure. This feeling that had crept up so quietly she had not recognized it until it was already rooted deep. October arrived with cooler temperatures and the promise of winter on the horizon. The ranch work shifted toward preparations for the cold months ahead, and Clara found herself busy not just with mending but also with making warmer clothes, sewing quilts from scraps, and waterproofing canvas for the men who would still work outdoors through snow and ice. Mr. Donnelly, true to his word, began paying her a small wage in addition to room and board. It was not much, but Clara saved every penny, tucking the money into the tin box she kept under her bed and imagining the day she might have enough to open that shop in Red Cloud. She and Dalton had fallen into an easy friendship that felt both comfortable and charged with possibility. He taught her to ride, spending patient hours helping her learn to balance despite her uneven legs, never once making her feel incapable or foolish. She sewed him a new shirt for his birthday, measuring him carefully and choosing fabric the color of the Montana sky, because she had noticed him looking at the horizon with longing in his eyes. When she presented it to him, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, he had gone very still. "You made this for me?" he asked, his voice rough. "You needed a good shirt. All of yours are work-worn. I thought you might like something nice for when you go into town." He unfolded it carefully, running his fingers over the neat stitching and the mother-of-pearl buttons she had splurged on from the general store. "Clara, this is the finest thing anyone has ever made for me. I do not know what to say. Say you like it. I love it. Thank you." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Clara felt the air between them shift into something new and unmapped. "You are a wonder, you know that." She ducked her head, flustered and pleased. "It is just a shirt." "It is not just a shirt. It is proof that someone sees me, thinks of me, cares enough to spend their time making something beautiful just for me. That is not something I have had much of in my life." He folded the shirt carefully and met her eyes again. "You matter to me, Clara. More than I probably should say, given I have no right to speak of such things. But it is true, and I wanted you to know it." Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "You matter to me too, Dalton." "Do I?" He took a step closer, then seemed to remember himself and stopped. "I do not want to presume. You came here running from one man's rejection. I would not add another man's unwanted attention to your troubles." "It would not be unwanted," Clara said softly, the words braver than she felt. "Your attention, I mean. It would not be unwanted." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise, bright and warming everything it touched. "In that case, Miss Clara Owens, might I have the honor of courting you properly, with intentions and respect and all the things a good woman deserves?" "Yes," she said, the word simple and sure. "Yes, you may." He took her hand carefully, as if it were something precious and fragile, and raised it to his lips. The kiss he pressed to her knuckles was gentle and reverent, and Clara felt it all the way to her toes. "I will do right by you," he promised. "I swear it on everything I hold dear." She believed him. Their courtship was conducted under the watchful but approving eyes of the entire ranch. Mr. Donnelly gave his blessing without hesitation, saying Dalton was the best man he knew and Clara deserved nothing less. Louis was openly delighted, already planning their wedding feast despite protests that they had only just begun courting. The ranch hands treated the budding romance with a mix of good-natured teasing and protective watchfulness, making it clear that Clara was part of their family now, and anyone who hurt her would answer to all of them. Dalton courted her with old-fashioned care. He walked with her in the evenings, matching his stride to hers without thinking, talking about dreams and futures and the life they might build together. He brought her wildflowers from the range, taught her to read the weather in the movement of clouds, shared stories about his childhood that made her laugh and understand him better. She sewed him things, cooked him favorite foods, and listened when he needed to talk through problems with the ranch or his worries about his sister back in Kentucky. They learned each other slowly, building trust and affection on a foundation of genuine friendship. The first time he kissed her, really kissed her, was on a Sunday afternoon in late October. They had ridden out to a spot he loved, a small rise overlooking the ranch with a view that stretched for miles. The autumn air was crisp and clean, and the aspens had turned gold against the evergreens. "This is the most beautiful place I have ever seen," Clara said, turning slowly to take it all in. "It is even more beautiful now," Dalton replied, and when she looked at him questioningly, he continued, "because you are in it." "That is terribly romantic for a cowboy," she teased, but her voice shook slightly. "I can be romantic when the situation calls for it." He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Clara, I am going to kiss you now, if that is all right with you." "It is more than all right." He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and pressed his lips to hers with a tenderness that made her eyes sting with tears. The kiss was gentle and searching, a question and an answer all at once. When he pulled back, his eyes were dark and warm. "I love you," he said simply. "I know it has only been a few months, but I love you and I wanted you to know it." "I love you too," Clara whispered, the truth of it filling her chest with so much emotion she could barely breathe. "I did not think I would ever feel this way. I thought love was something that happened to other people, not to broken women with limps and no prospects." Dalton's expression turned fierce. "You are not broken. You are perfect exactly as you are. Your limp does not define you, Clara. It is just part of who you are, like your blonde hair or your blue eyes or the way you hum when you sew. All the parts together make you the woman I love." She kissed him then, rising on her toes and pulling him down to her, pouring all her feelings into the connection of their lips. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dalton rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know I should wait, should court you longer and do things properly. But I know my heart, Clara, and it is yours. It has been since the moment I saw you standing outside that tailor shop looking lost and brave all at once. Marry me and let me spend the rest of my life proving you made the right choice." "Yes," Clara said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you, Dalton Matthews." They were married in the church in Red Cloud on a cold November morning with the whole town in attendance. Clara wore a dress she had made herself, simple but beautiful, and carried wildflowers that Dalton had ridden out before dawn to pick. Mrs. Fletcher cried openly, claiming she had known they would end up together from the first day. Louis served as Dalton's best man and wept unashamedly through the entire ceremony. Mr. Donnelly gave Clara away, and his gruff voice was suspiciously thick when he placed her hand in Dalton's. Harold Preston attended, sitting in the back of the church with his hat in his hands. Afterward, he approached Clara and Dalton where they stood accepting congratulations from the well-wishers. "Miss Owens, Mr. Matthews," he said formally, then corrected himself. "Mrs. Matthews, I suppose now. I wanted to offer my congratulations and my apologies. I was wrong that day at the station. Wrong and foolish. I can see now what I missed then. You are a fine woman, and Dalton is a lucky man." Clara felt Dalton tense beside her, but she squeezed his hand and smiled at Preston. "Thank you, Mr. Preston. I wish you well in your search for a wife." "I hope you find what you are looking for." Preston nodded, shook Dalton's hand, and left without further word. When he was gone, Dalton pulled Clara close. "You are a better person than I am," he murmured into her hair. "I wanted to knock him flat for what he did to you." "He did me a favor," Clara said, leaning into her husband's embrace. "If he had not rejected me, I never would have met you. Everything happened exactly as it needed to." The wedding feast was held at the ranch, Lewis outdoing himself with food and drink and a cake that was a work of art. The ranch hands toasted the couple repeatedly, their rough voices warm with genuine affection. Dancing followed, someone produced a fiddle, and Dalton swept Clara around the cleared space of the barn with careful attention to her comfort and joy. "Happy?" he asked as they swayed together. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be," she replied honestly. "This morning I became Mrs. Dalton Matthews, and I still cannot quite believe it is real." "Believe it, love. You are mine and I am yours for the rest of our lives." They spent their wedding night in the cottage that had been Clara's alone, but was now theirs together. Dalton was gentle and patient, turning what could have been awkward into something beautiful and right. Afterward, lying in his arms with her head on his chest, Clara felt a peace settle over her that she had never known before. She was home, not just in a place, but with a person. She was loved and safe and cherished exactly as she was. Life on the double bar M continued its rhythm through the winter months. Clara moved her sewing operation into a corner of the main house where it was warmer, and she spent the short, cold days working while Lewis cooked and told stories. Dalton worked long hours keeping the ranch running through snow and ice, but he always came home to her at night, and that made everything worthwhile. In the spring, Mr. Donnelly called Dalton into his office for a private conversation. When Dalton emerged an hour later, he looked dazed. "What happened?" Clara asked, alarmed by his expression. "He is giving me 500 acres on the eastern border of his property, says it is wedding gift and payment for 10 years of loyalty. He is helping me buy a starter herd and giving me lumber from his wood lot to build a house." Dalton sat down heavily in the kitchen chair. "Clara, we are going to have our own ranch, our own land." She threw her arms around him, laughing with delight. "That is wonderful. Oh, Dalton, you have worked so hard for this." "We will work hard together," he corrected, pulling her into his lap. "This is ours, Clara. Our future, our dream, our life." They broke ground on the house in April, working alongside hired help and ranch hands who volunteered their time. The design was simple but solid: 2 bedrooms, a large kitchen, a parlor with windows facing the mountains Clara loved. There was also a small room specifically for Clara's sewing, with good light and shelves for her supplies. By July, the house was finished, and they moved in with help from everyone on the double bar M. Their first night alone in their own home, they sat on the front porch and watched the sun set over land that belonged to them. "You ever think about that day at the train station?" Dalton asked, his arm around Clara's shoulders. "Sometimes. It feels like a lifetime ago now, like it happened to a different person." "In a way, it did. You are not the same woman who stepped off that train scared and rejected. You are stronger now, more sure of yourself." Clara considered this. "I think I was always strong. I just needed someone to see it and believe in it until I could believe in it myself." "You did that for me, Dalton. You saw me when I could not see myself." "You walked perfectly beside me from the very first day," he said, echoing the words that had changed everything. That has never changed and never will. Their first year of marriage was full of hard work and harder lessons. Building a ranch from almost nothing tested them in ways neither had anticipated. There were late calves and early blizzards, broken equipment and tight finances, moments when Clara wondered if they had taken on too much too soon. But there were also mornings watching the sunrise over their land, evenings sitting together planning for the future, nights falling asleep exhausted but satisfied in each other's arms. Slowly, steadily, they built something real and lasting. In the spring of their second year of marriage, Clara realized she was pregnant. She told Dalton on a warm May evening, watching nervousness and joy chase each other across his face. "A baby," he said wonderingly, placing his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Clara asked, suddenly uncertain. "Happy does not begin to cover it. Clara, you have given me everything. A home, a purpose, love I never thought I deserved, and now a family. I am the most blessed man in Montana Territory." Their son was born in January of 1885 during a snowstorm that kept the doctor from reaching their ranch for 2 days. Lewis and Mr. Donnelly's new wife, Sarah, a practical woman he had married the previous summer, helped Clara through the delivery. When Dalton finally held his son, a healthy boy with a strong cry and a shock of dark hair, he wept openly. "What should we name him?" Clara asked, exhausted but glowing. "Thomas," Dalton said immediately. "After my father, but this Thomas will have the life my father never gave me. Love and stability and parents who choose him every day." Thomas Matthews was a happy baby who grew into a curious toddler with his father's eyes and his mother's determination. Clara discovered that her limp did not hinder her mothering any more than it had hindered anything else she set her mind to. She carried Thomas on her hip, chased him through the house, and loved him with a fierceness that sometimes scared her with its intensity. Their ranch prospered slowly but surely. Dalton's skill with horses became known throughout the territory, and he began breeding and training working horses for other ranchers. Clara opened a small shop in Red Cloud, just as she had once dreamed, spending 2 days a week in town sewing for paying customers while Sarah minded Thomas. On their 5th wedding anniversary, they sat on their porch watching Thomas play in the yard with the ranch dog, a patient beast who tolerated the 3-year-old's enthusiastic attention with good grace. "You ever regret it?" Dalton asked. "Staying here instead of going back to Boston?" "Sometimes I think about what your life might have been if you had returned east." Clara turned to look at her husband, this good man who had seen her worth when she could not see it herself, who loved her wholly and without reservation, who had given her a life beyond her wildest imaginings. "Not for one single moment," she said firmly. "My life is here with you, with Thomas, with this land we have built together. Boston was my past, but you are my present and my future. I would choose you every time, Dalton Matthews, every single time." He pulled her close and kissed her temple. "I love you, Clara, more today than yesterday, more tomorrow than today." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching their son play as the Montana sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. In the distance, cattle grazed on their land. In town, Clara's shop bore her name on a neat sign. In the house behind them, a second bedroom waited hopefully for the baby Clara suspected, but had not yet confirmed was growing inside her. She thought about the woman who had stepped off that train 5 years ago, heartbroken and certain her life was over. That woman could never have imagined this happiness, this fullness, this absolute rightness of a life built on love and mutual respect. Harold Preston had rejected her because of her limp, seeing it as a weakness that would make her unsuitable for frontier life. He had been wrong in every way that mattered. Her limp had never stopped her from doing anything she truly wanted to do. It had not stopped her from building a home, raising a child, running a business, or loving a man with her whole heart. And Dalton, wonderful Dalton, had seen the truth from the very beginning. The limp was simply part of who she was, no more limiting than the color of her eyes or the sound of her laugh. He had matched his stride to hers without thinking, without judgment, without seeing it as a burden to bear. "You walk perfectly beside me." Those words, spoken on their first day together, had proven prophetic. They did walk perfectly together, through good times and hard times, through success and struggle, through all the beautiful ordinary moments that made up a life. Their second child, a daughter they named Catherine after Clara's mother, was born the following spring. She had Clara's blonde hair and a temperament as sunny as a summer day. Thomas adored his baby sister, bringing her flowers from the garden and singing her the lullabies he dimly remembered Clara singing to him. The years passed in the way years do, sometimes slow and sometimes heartbreakingly fast. Thomas grew tall and serious, with his father's way with horses and his mother's careful attention to detail. Catherine was quicksilver and laughter, always moving, always curious, bringing life and joy wherever she went. The ranch continued to prosper. Dalton's reputation as a horse breeder spread beyond Montana territory, and he began selling to buyers from Wyoming and even California. Clara's shop in Red Cloud became a fixture of the town, known for quality work and fair prices. They hired help as they needed it, always treating their employees with the respect and dignity Mr. Donnelly had shown Dalton all those years ago. Lewis passed away peacefully in his sleep when Thomas was 10, and the entire territory turned out for his funeral. Clara wept for the friend who had seen her heart before she had known it herself, who had welcomed her into his kitchen and his life without hesitation. They named their third child, another son born 2 years after Catherine, Lewis, in his honor. Mr. Donnelly lived to see his 80th birthday, sharp-minded to the end, before passing in the autumn of 1899. He left the double bar M to his stepson, but he left Dalton a letter that Clara found him reading with tears streaming down his face. "He says he was proud of me," Dalton managed, his voice breaking. "Says he knew from the day he met me that I would make something of myself if someone just gave me a chance. He thanks me for proving him right and for being the son he never had." They buried Marcus Donnelly on the highest point of his ranch, overlooking the land he had loved and worked for 50 years. Dalton spoke at the funeral, his voice steady despite his grief, talking about second chances and the power of seeing potential in people others had overlooked. As the new century dawned, Dalton and Clara found themselves settling into the comfortable rhythms of middle age. Their children were growing, Thomas already talking about starting his own ranch, Catherine showing a talent for music that delighted her mother, young Lewis todding after his older siblings with determined steps. Red Cloud had grown from a dusty frontier town into a proper community with a school, 3 churches, and even a small newspaper. Clara's shop had expanded, and she now employed 2 young women learning the seamstress trade. She thought sometimes about the girl she had been, desperate and alone, convinced that her limp made her unworthy of love or success. How wrong she had been. How grateful she was to have been wrong. On a summer evening in 1902, 20 years after Clara had first arrived in Red Cloud, she and Dalton sat on their porch watching the sunset. Their children were inside, Thomas reading to Catherine and Lewis before bed, their voices drifting through the open windows. "Do you remember what I said to you the first day we met?" Dalton asked, reaching for Clara's hand. "You said a lot of things that first day." I said you walk perfectly beside me. Do you remember? I remember. It was the kindest thing anyone had ever said to me. Dalton turned to look at her, his face showing the weathering of 20 years under the Montana sun, his eyes as warm and loving as they had been on that first day. It was not kindness. It was truth. You do walk perfectly beside me, Clara. You always have. In every way that matters, we match each other stride for stride. Clara felt tears prickling at her eyes, the good kind that came from overwhelming emotion rather than sorrow. We do not we? Even when I thought I would never find anyone who could love me as I am, there you were, seeing me, choosing me, loving me. Loving you was the easiest thing I ever did. It still is. He raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles just as he had on the day he had asked to court her. Every day I wake up grateful that Harold Preston was fool enough to send you away. His loss gave me everything I hold dear. They sat together as the sun painted the sky and their children's voices made music in the house they had built together. This life, this love, this family, all of it had grown from a moment of rejection and a simple act of kindness. One man had seen her limp and turned her away. Another had seen past it to the woman beneath, and that had made all the difference. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Clara leaned her head on her husband's shoulder and smiled. She had traveled 2,000 miles to find rejection, and instead she had found home. Not in a place, but in a person who saw her completely and loved her without reservation. "What are you thinking about?" Dalton asked softly. "About how lucky I am. About how perfect my life turned out to be, even though it started so imperfectly. About how much I love you." "Your life did not start imperfectly," Dalton corrected gently. "It started exactly as it needed to. Every step, even the painful ones, led you here. Led us here. To this porch, this family, this life we have built together. That is not imperfect, Clara. That is beautiful." She lifted her head to kiss him, pouring 2 decades of love and gratitude into the connection. When they parted, both were smiling. "You are right," she said. "It is beautiful. All of it." Inside, Thomas called out that Lewis had fallen asleep and should they wake him or let him sleep. Catherine's laugh followed, bright and musical. Dalton stood and offered Clara his hand, pulling her to her feet with the easy strength of a man who had spent his life working hard. They walked inside together, their steps matched, their hearts aligned, their love as steady and true as it had been from the very beginning. The house welcomed them with warmth and light and the happy chaos of family life. This was what love looked like, Clara thought as she helped Dalton carry a sleeping Lewis to his bed. Not perfect or polished or easy, but real and deep and enduring. Built on a foundation of seeing and being seen, of choosing and being chosen, of walking side by side through whatever life brought. Years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows as years always do. Catherine married a young lawyer from Billings and gave them grandchildren who visited every summer, filling the ranch with laughter and noise. Thomas took over the horse breeding operation and expanded it beyond even his father's dreams, his gentle way with animals becoming legendary throughout the territory. Lewis, their youngest, surprised everyone by becoming a teacher, taking over the schoolhouse in Red Cloud and bringing the same warmth and wisdom his namesake had possessed to a new generation of children. Dalton's hair went silver at the temples, then white altogether. Clara's hands grew stiff with arthritis, making sewing more difficult, but she adapted, training younger women to carry on her work while she handled the business side of the shop. Her limp grew more pronounced with age, but it still did not stop her from doing anything she set her mind to. They celebrated their 30th anniversary surrounded by children and grandchildren. the ranch they had built together thriving under Thomas's management. Dalton gave a toast that made everyone laugh and cry in equal measure, talking about the day he had met a beautiful woman with sad eyes outside a tailor shop, and how his whole life had changed in that moment. "I said she walked perfectly beside me," he concluded, raising his glass toward Clara. 30 years later, that is still the truest thing I know. Clara Matthews, you are the best decision I ever made. Here is to 30 more years of walking together. They did not get 30 more years. Life is not a fairy tale, and even the greatest loves must eventually face mortality. But they got 15 more good years, full and rich and deeply satisfying. They saw all their children settled and happy, welcomed more grandchildren, even lived to meet their first great-grandchild. When Dalton passed in the winter of 1917, he went peacefully in his sleep with Clara beside him as she had been for 35 years. She held his hand as his breathing slowed and stopped, and though her heart broke, she was grateful. Grateful for every moment they had shared, every laugh and tear and ordinary day that had made up their extraordinary life together. At his funeral, with their children and grandchildren gathered around, Clara spoke about the man he had been. Not perfect, but good. Not without flaws, but worthy. A man who had seen worth in a limping woman when no one else had, who had built a life and a legacy on the simple foundation of choosing love over prejudice, possibility over limitation. "He taught me that I was not broken," she said, her voice strong despite her grief. "He taught me that the things the world sees as flaws are just part of who we are, no more limiting than we allow them to be. He matched his stride to mine and never once made me feel like I was slowing him down. That is love. That is the gift he gave me and through me gave to all of you." Clara lived another 5 years after Dalton's passing, long enough to see the end of the Great War and the dawn of a new decade. She spent her final years in the house they had built together, surrounded by children and grandchildren who visited often, filling the rooms with life and love. On a spring morning in 1922, 40 years after she had first stepped off a train in Red Cloud expecting rejection and finding love instead, Clara Matthews passed peacefully in her sleep. She was buried beside Dalton on the rise overlooking the ranch they had built, the mountains they had loved standing eternal watch in the distance. At her funeral, her children spoke of her strength, her kindness, her refusal to let anything stop her from living fully and loving deeply. Her grandchildren talked about the stories she had told them, about her journey west and the cowboy who had seen her heart. Her great-grandchildren were too young to speak, but they laid wildflowers on her grave, bright spots of color against the spring grass. Thomas, now in his 50s and running the ranch that bore his father's name, gave the final words. "My mother came to Montana Territory with nothing but a carpet bag and a limp and a heart that had been broken by rejection. She left this world surrounded by love, having built a business, a family, and a legacy that will continue through all of us. She taught us that limitations are often just challenges waiting to be overcome, that what others see as weaknesses can be strengths if we refuse to be defined by them." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "My father used to say she walked perfectly beside him. She did. But she also walked perfectly on her own, blazing a trail that we are all still following. Rest well, Mama. You earned it." The story of Clara and Dalton Matthews became part of Red Cloud's history, passed down through generations as an example of what love could be, when it was based on seeing the whole person rather than focusing on surface imperfections. The ranch remained in the family for nearly a century, and the shop Clara had founded operated under the Matthews name until the 1970s, when the last grandchild to run it finally retired. But the real legacy was not in land or businesses. It was in the lesson their life had taught. That rejection from the wrong person can lead to acceptance from the right one. That perceived flaws are often just facets of who we are, and that true love sees past the surface to the soul beneath. A mail-order bride with a limp had been rejected by a man too blind to see her worth. A cowboy had looked at her and seen not a limitation but a woman who walked perfectly beside him. From that moment of seeing and being seen, a love story had unfolded that lasted a lifetime and echoed through generations. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.